All right, cool. Um, Welcome everybody. We've got this going and recording. Yeah, Carter. We will record this, so it'll be up there again. Hopefully, people are kind of getting in the groove. It's set up this class to try and be pretty predictable. It's a lot of repeat. Everything's the same every single time, just so that I'm not throwing you curveballs. But yeah, I'm gonna have to apologize for people. I forgot to send out an announcement verifying that we would meet same time, same place. But we'll have this all on record. People are going to ask me questions if they aren't able to catch the whole thing. So let's just jump in. Questions. What stuff would people like clarification on, examples, stuff from lecture that caused confusion or consternation? Anything. Oh, someone jumped in. I'm having a hard time hearing. Oh, Jonathan, was that you? You're the only one who doesn't have a. Okay, I can. What's going on? Behavioral genetics. Okay, cool. Anything in particular about behavioral genetics that
No, it's just the one I'm probably the most confused on. Not
oh,
confused, but unfamiliar with.
okay. Okay, cool. Um yeah, let's go through and we can cover some of this stuff. Okay. So, this is good to cover, and sort of wanted to talk about from a classic behavioral genetics perspective, some of the stuff that are some of the designs that we might want to sort of know about and sort of kind of really what this is teasing apart. So someone tell me when we're talking about variability. Someone tell me what we're talking about in terms of variability. What is this? What is this fancy language for? Any ideas? Okay.
Environment and genetic, or not genetic, just different aspects that affect things.
Yeah, yeah. So starting to get into if I say something is variable, right? It just means that uh, there are differences. So variability just means differences, and this is what we're trying to do in a behavioral genetics approach. Is we're trying to understand sort of the relative contribution of genetics and environment to differences in some trait. Okay, so again, if we took a look at everybody who's logged into the meeting right now, we see different people have different sort of heights, eye color, personality, sort of all this type of stuff, right? And so with the behavioral genetics approach, what we're trying to do is understand and sort of use some different techniques to tease apart what's genetics, what's shared environment, and what's maybe a contribution of unique environment. Okay? So a family study. Can anybody tell me what we're trying to do with a family study? Anybody remember?
Seeing if genetics are more to occur more often within relatives versus non-related folks.
Yeah, perfect, Jonathan. Going to tweak this a little bit. Sort of the family study. The question of the family study is some trait more common within the family of an individual who possesses the trait relative to someone who doesn't possess that trait, right? So what we're going to do, let's say we want to look at I don't know, let's just talk about depression. Okay. Let's say we want to see sort of what is the heritability of depression, right? So maybe what I do is I get some individuals who have a history of depression and some individuals who don't have a history of depression, and then I start to interview their close family members, right? And what I want to see, is if those individuals in my sample who have depression, if it's more likely that their immediate family members have depression than people in my study who don't have depression, right? And if we see big differences, people who struggle with depression tend to have brothers, sisters, moms, dads who struggle with depression, and people who don't have depression have moms, dads, brothers, sisters who don't have depression. What we would start to say is it looks like there is some evidence that depression runs in families, okay? And if we started to get a little bit more nuanced, what we might do is we might start to look at, do we see stronger associations if we're talking about first-degree relatives as opposed to second-degree relatives, so on and so forth, okay? And so this is a classic family study. We're just getting groups of people who are high on some trait and some people who are low on some trait, let's say, and then we want to see if we see higher levels of that trait in the families of individuals with it versus the families without, okay? And that's your basic family study. And so we can start to sort of get an idea of whether or not things run in families. What can't we do? What's the limitation of this study if we're trying to tease apart genetics versus shared environment versus unique environment stuff? What are we missing with a family study? Or what's confusing? Any brave souls? Zero bravery in this group. Okay. All right. Let's say I do find that depression runs more heavily in individuals, in the families of individuals with depression versus not depression. How do I know whether or not this is genetics or just something about the family environment, right? I can't tell that with a family study, right? I can't tease apart genetics versus what might just be something in that family environment that's contributing to depression, right? Same thing, let's say I'm looking at aggression, right? And I find that people who are aggressive, if I'm like, so to say, looking third graders, if I grab third graders and I grab a bunch of third graders who demonstrate aggression in school, high levels of aggression in school, and kids who don't demonstrate aggression, and I find that aggressive kids tend to have brothers, sisters, moms, dads who have higher levels of aggression than kids who don't demonstrate aggression, right? Is it fair for me to say, oh, this is good evidence of a genetic transmission of aggression? Probably not, right? Maybe these are just kids that grow up in aggressive environments and there's nothing to do with genetics. It's just sort of how sort of my background, where I'm coming from, it's all environment stuff, right? So with a family study, we can see that things are tend to run in families, but it's not so good at telling us, sort of teasing apart what's genetics versus what's maybe an environmental factor. Okay, so if I get a family study and it looks like things run in families, it might be genetics, but it could be environment as well. Okay. Questions about the family study?
So when we talk sometimes about environment versus genetics in a family, would the environment contribute to the epigenetics of that aggression?
Okay, yeah. And so hold on to that, Jonathan. Sort of let's not get into the epigenetics piece of things quite yet. Okay. Because epigenetics then sort of takes the whole thing and sort of turns it on its head. And sort of uses a different sort of type of approach. Okay, so let's say we run a family study, find that depression or aggression or something like that does run in families. Okay, so what we want to do now is start to tease apart, is this genetics or is it this shared environment that families have, right? What we would then do is we go to a twin study. Okay, and remember in the twin study, our question here is a trait more common among identical twins than among fraternal twins? Okay, because remember, our identical twins. Okay, you're an identical twin? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so Kay is identical twin is an identical clone. For all intents and purposes, same DNA, okay? Which means if there's something that's genetic, those two should have it because they're working with the same genes, right? But if we have a fraternal twin, these are just two different eggs that happen to be fertilized at the same time, and so fraternal twins are only as related as sort of any other sort of brother sister situation, right? So about 50% similar genes, right? So if we go through and let's say again we're looking at sort of depression, and we find a bunch of twins, fraternal twins, identical twins, and fraternal twins who are all twin, or some have depression and some don't, or excuse me, fraternal twins, identical twins with sort of where one of them has depression, identical or fraternal twins where one of them has depression, and what we're looking at is concordance, right? If I have depression, or if I struggle with depression, does my twin struggle with depression, right? And if we find that identical twins match up more often in terms of depression history than fraternal twins, what do we conclude based on that study?
Would you just conclude that identical twins are more likely to have depression together rather than apart, like fraternal twins?
Perfect. Yes, exactly, Keely. And what that would mean is if we've got our identical twins, our genetic clones for the purposes of our study, and the fraternal twins have 50% shared, the inference that we're going to take away from that is that because shared environment is going to be the same. We're assuming that shared environment for identical twins is the same shared environment as fraternal twins. If everybody's got the same shared environment, it can't be shared environment. If we're seeing differences across identical twins and fraternal twins, it's got to be a genetics issue, right? And so you think about the twin study as a step up from the family study. Family study can show that things run in families, but the twin study really starts to tease apart what's a shared environmental factor versus a genetics. Okay. Questions on the twin study? Okay. What do we not get from the twin study? What's the last piece of the puzzle that's not being that we haven't yet talked about? Someone throw me a lifeline.
What happens when they're separated?
Well, what happens when they're separated? Exactly, Jonathan. And what if I'm separated from my twin? What type of environmental factor or environmental influences do I have relative to my twin? It's a unique environment, right? If I'm separated, if I'm adopted, if I'm sort of living somewhere completely different, all of my environmental factors are unique, right? Because I'm living somewhere completely else in a completely different environment, right? It's my own unique stuff. And what we don't know with our twin studies, we can't get at the relative influence of the unique environment. And so this is where we get into our adoption study. In our adoption study, we're asking what's the influence of different environments on genetically similar individuals. So here what we do is we find some individuals who have been adopted, preferably people who have been adopted very early on in infancy, sort of before they sort of like maybe at birth, right? That would probably be the best control. And then what we do is we go through and let's say, again, if we're looking at depression, right? We would say, okay, we've got individuals who sort of are high in depression who are adopted. Are they more similar in terms of risk for depression among their adopted family versus their biological family? Okay. And if we see an increase, a greater increase in risk among the biological relatives of adopted individuals as opposed to their adopted families, again, we would say that this is evidence of genetic transmission, right? Because if I'm more similar to my biological family, who I've never seen, who I've never met, who I've never functionally interacted with, right? If it was an environmental factor, I should be much more similar to my adoptive parents, right? But if I find that even though I've been surrounded and sort of immersed in this adopted family environment, If I'm still similar to my biological family, suggests that sort of a greater impact of genes. And so across these 3 studies, each has relative strengths and weaknesses. And if we want to tease apart, if we're just looking at family transmission, are people more similar? Do traits run in families? Then we're running family study. If we're trying to tease apart genetics versus shared environment, we're looking at a twin study. If we're trying to tease apart unique environment versus genetics, then we're looking at our adoption study. So depending on sort of what my question is and where we're going, sort of different methods that we're using here. And the assumption is the working model here, Jonathan, sort of get to transition into what you had asked about, is the idea is that we've got genetics, shared environment, and unique environment. We add those things up, and that accounts for the variability that we see in some trait. Okay. But this is kind of an old school way of thinking about things. As we've gotten more advanced and more sort of kind of sophisticated in thinking about this stuff, what we start to realize is that is maybe not working with, we're probably not working with some sort of additive model. And this is where we get into epigenetics, where we see that it's not, let's see, what I don't have is my shared environment just operating independently of my unique and my genetics isn't operating independently of this and this. So they're not all sort of just doing their same thing. What we get is interactions. We get things that are impacted by one another, right? And this is where epigenetics comes into play. This idea that I may have, so Kea again is a genetic clone of her identical sister, okay? But you, Kea, are likely different in some important ways than your sister, correct? There are certain things that you experience that she doesn't, some vulnerabilities that she has that you don't, right? And if it was 100% genetics, we would expect you two to be identical in every way. Similar, but you're not identical in all aspects of things, right? You have the same genes, you have the same potential to have certain qualities, certain traits, and things along those lines. But from an epigenetic standpoint, what we would say is it was part of aspects of our environment, things that have been sort of external environmental factors that I'm exposed to start to increase my vulnerability for some things versus others. Okay, so let's say, okay, we're going to get dark here. I apologize for keep using you as an example. But let's say that there is somewhere in your family history genetic risk for alcohol abuse or some alcohol use disorder. Okay, and so maybe you develop an alcohol use disorder, your twin sister doesn't, right? Now we would assume that you both have the same genetic vulnerability for, or the same risk for developing difficulties with alcohol use, right? But you developed it, she didn't, right? And so what we would think about from an epigenetic standpoint is there was maybe some sort of environmental trigger, some sort of stressor, some sort of experience. We often think about stressors, toxins, sort of things along those lines, right? That for some reason in you activated a certain sequence of genes that then increased some combination of your experience and sort of stressors that then triggered sort of that chain that then caused you, then sort of led you to start to experience the difficulties with alcohol that your sister didn't, right? And so basically what we'd say, even though you have all the same genes, you have certain genes that have been turned on by your environment that sort of have elevated and transitioned into a case of alcohol abuse disorder, whereas your sister didn't have those things, and so those genes weren't turned on. And so maybe she still was drinking or using stuff, but she just doesn't have the same difficulty that you do, right? This would be an example of epigenetics. When you think about epigenetics, think about, again, we're getting close to winter, sort of coat change in sort of animals, right? We see animals go from dark coats to white coats in winter. It's not like they could get swapped out some new jeans, right? Like I went to the jeans store, I got new jeans, and now I got new jeans for winter, right? These are the new improved winter jeans. had them there all along, right? It's just something in some environmental factor needed to trigger those, trip those. And so now all of a sudden my hair starts growing white as opposed to brown, right? In animals, it's going to be temperature, sort of daylight, sort of things along those lines, right? But it's sort of this idea that it's not just like what's the unique combination of genetics, what's the unique piece of my environment, and these things operating independently. It looks like there's an interaction. They interact together. So every sort of whole group of people can have the same vulnerability, but only some of them are going to go through and express the genes necessary, because some people are going to experience whatever it is that turns those on, some people aren't, and then that's going to determine behavior. Okay. All right, so that was a really long rant on genes and genetics and epigenetics, but
I have a question about
does that help?
actually.
Okay, yeah, Colin, go for it.
So I was wondering, does the age or like I guess the placement, like the stage in your development as a child, also like change how that would work? Like, do certain factors only trigger genes dependent on like how young you are?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. And I don't know 100% with confidence, but I would say if I were a betting man, I would go maybe all in on that proposition. Okay, because what we see a lot of times, and I'm a clinical psychologist, so think about psychopathology types of stuff, right? We see that onset for a lot of different types of difficulties, sort of alcohol use stuff, some depression, some things that sort of bipolar disorder, OCD types of things tend to have an onset adolescence, late adolescence, right? And again, as we've been talking about through this whole unit, biologically, we come out sort of half-baked or maybe a quarter-baked. It takes us a long time to sort of go through and mature. All of you who are 18, 19 years old right now still have some growing to do in terms of your brain and sort of physiology and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I think that's probably sort of all that stuff that happens in childhood, likely in terms like, if I'm like 65, there's not often things that like new stuff doesn't happen when you're 65. Like, well, I guess new stuff does happen when you're 60, but you get old and but it's not like all of a sudden, like I sort of developed bipolar disorder at 65. Like that's not something that happens, right? So probably we think about that developmental window from birth to adolescence through young adulthood is really, really important in terms of, and some of this is going to be just learning factors, right? If I'm in an environment where I get to interact with other people and I learn how to socialize with folks and I am around people who are different than me and I have to learn how to navigate stuff. That's not necessarily biology. That's just sort of experience, right? But there's also going to be stuff that goes on that starts to impact from an epigenetic standpoint, probably turning on and off certain genes that may, and it's going to be a combination of genes that sort of confer risk for some things versus others, good things and bad things, right? And so, Colin, yeah, I think in thinking about how this operates, we're much more malleable when we're young as opposed to we start to get older, and then things start to get set a little bit more in stone. Not to say that things can't pop up, they do sometimes, but probably that developmental window from birth to about where you all are is probably sort of more important, I would guess. Cool. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it, Keely.
So in social development, we were talking about the styles like secure, avoidant.
Okay, yeah.
Would a child who's more avoidant be at greater risk to be classified as special needs?
Could be. What we typically think about, and that's a good question, with these attachment styles, the idea is that sort of these attachment styles aren't necessarily indicative of psychopathology, like special needs types of things. I think in the original sort of conceptualization, these are just different ways that sort of people interact. And so a lot of it is based on early developmental type of things. I don't know. I was reading a psychological report on something the other day, and someone was like, oh, this person didn't have this in childhood, and so that's going to screw their attachment and they're going to be ruined forever. That's garbage. It's nonsense. It's some weird Freudian stuff. That's not actually how things work, no matter what people believe, right? But we do know that different kids, and you all know this, right? You've been around people, you're humans who were around humans at one point in our lifetime, maybe not now, but sort of at some point in your past, right? Some kids are easygoing, some kids are more difficult, right? We have friends who have different ways of interacting with folks, right? And a lot of this starts to come down to temperament, right? And so this idea is this avoidant attachment, Keely, that you were asking about. It's this, again, in the strange situation paradigm, parent and child are together, kid's not interested in parent, kid's doing its own thing, stranger comes in, kid doesn't really care, isn't paying attention to stranger or parent. Parent leaves, it's just the stranger and the kid. Kid interacts with the stranger about the same as they interact with the parent. Parent comes back. Usually in a secure attachment, we would see or expect the child to go through and sort of use parent as a strong sort of base for exploration. But the avoidant attachment, sort of, okay, fine, whatever. Basically, kind of sort of set off, sort of doing their own thing, not really getting too worked up one way or the other what's going around. Not in an easygoing way, more along the lines of like, I'm not interested or engaged in sort of caregiver or stranger. And what we might expect from this person, at least from the model, is that that's someone who might grow up as they grow older, have a hard time with sort of relationships or forming close relationships, or just seem to not be as interested in developing sort of those intimate, close relationships with other people. Maybe I have, a boyfriend, girlfriend, partner, something like that, but sort of it tends to go wrong because I'm not emotionally available and I'm not sort of really all that engaged. And so that's kind of the idea of that avoidant attachment style as opposed to a secure attachment style, right? Like I don't need to be in your business all the time, but I have friends who are very, very close friends. And then I have other friends who are sort of more like acquaintances. And then there are people who I kind of know. I'm able to differentiate the two. I'm able to do my own thing, but I do have close relationships that I get invested and involved in. I have my people who I really like, and those are kind of my touchstones. But sort of I'm pretty good sort of interacting with other folks. Okay, that's kind of this secure attachment. And then the ambivalent, right? These are people with lots of highs and lots of lows. Okay, these are kids who 1 minute love you to death, second minute hate your face, right? Like in sort of jump around, sort of like, okay, I love you, I love you, I love you, but then you leave, and now I'm going to hold a grudge, and I'm going to be really kind of rotten to you because you did this thing to me. But now I love you again, but next minute I don't. And so it's this ambivalent sort of really sort of high highs, low lows, a more unstable type of thing, right? And if we think about people we know or sort of maybe ourselves, there's a lot of folks who we might know who are kind of like this, right? And so the idea behind this whole attachment idea is that sort of early on, sort of my experiences with caregivers start to sort of pave the way for relationships down the road, okay? But again, the thing that's interesting about this when we start to really look at this is it looks to be, again, an interaction of sort of kind of what I'm born with and then my environment, right? If I'm kind of a miserable kid and no one really wants to be around me, sort of my love and attention that I'm going to receive from people is probably intermittent, right? It's probably not going to be constant. And if people will ignore me or withdraw from me at any given point in time, that probably makes me super anxious about whether or not people love me or want to be around me. And then I get too needy and sort of want things, but then I misinterpret people's cues, and then I get really upset if I don't think they like me or want me around. And so you see this sort of the temperament interacting with how sort of the responses that I elicit from other people, and then that reinforcing kind of this thing that I've already got going on. And so again, we see this interaction. Okay. Does that help, Keely, to kind of walk through kind of the idea behind attachment at least?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. Other questions on this unit? I think Alex singing a song right now. Like that's what's going on. We got played music in the background. Other questions? Feeling comfortable with this? All right, Carter, I see you got a question here. What's the part of the quiz people struggle with the most? I don't know that there's any one thing, man, that people are sort of particularly trip people up, right? Again, what you want to be doing is making sure that you've gone through all the lectures, right? And if you didn't take notes, if you were there in person while they were going, go back through, make sure that you got a handle on the lecture, that you have notes. Make sure that you take a look at the lecture summary slides. I mean, I don't go through these in class because you all can read, but it's just kind of hitting the high points. And then these comprehension check slides going to be, if you can answer these questions without your notes, without assistance, you're going to be in pretty good shape. So make sure that you're able to do that. Make sure that you've gone through and read each one of the modules, that you've taken notes on the modules. That's going to be important. Obviously, you want to hit the bolded terms and the italicized terms, things along those lines. That's going to be important. But also going through and making sure that you read sort of main points, right? Because sometimes you're going to hit points in those modules that don't have a keyword, right? Like, and you might say, sweet, there's nothing important there. It's a wrong thing, right? There's important stuff in there. If there was no important stuff there, they probably wouldn't put things. As an aside, for those few of you who are here, I'm going to give you sage advice. Never ask an instructor, hey, I was gone yesterday. Did we do anything important? Right? That's a terrible, like people say, there are no bad questions. That's a terrible question. That's a terrible question. Because what it assumes is that I kept you for 50 minutes with absolutely nothing useful to say, that I just sort of talked about some things that had zero relevance at all, right? But as you're approaching which could be true, but in my mind is probably not true, so don't ask people. Instructors sort of don't like that question. Say, I was gone. Can you tell me, is there anything I missed that I need to make up in terms of work and things like that? That's a better way to frame that. So as you're going through the module, so if there's stuff that doesn't have keywords, make sure that you've got main ideas, main points, right? If you're talking about different research and stuff like that, kind of know the general gist, write that stuff down. And then if you have access to that Launchpad or the Launchpad website, get on there. Just work through those learning curves. Those are going to tell you real quick whether or not you have a good handle on the module material. If you're going through, again, the learning curve activities at the end of each module, you're going to go through and it's going to give you multiple choice questions, fill in the blanks over and over and over. And it's nice because it'll let you do it however long you want to do it. A good way to get a sense for whether or not you got a handle on that material. And if you do, you'll knock them out of the park. If you don't, right? This is another thing too. People say, oh, well, I know it. I just sort of don't know it right now. No, it means you need to practice it more. Okay. So again, I think the other thing I'm concerned about sort of doing this stuff online is the possibility of people like, oh, I've got my notes. So if anytime I need a question, I can go back to my notes or the text. You can, but you're going to run out of time. It's just because we don't have enough time to go through and sort of look everything up with that type of stuff. So make sure that you've got good notes on the lectures, focusing on examples, right? Because I'm asking a lot of applied questions. So make sure that you got that. Make sure that you've read through the modules, taken notes there. Look at these comprehension check and lecture summary slides. And if you're doing good on those aspects and you sort of can give examples, you should be pretty good in terms of moving into this next quiz. Questions on any other content stuff? Jacob, I saw you just popped in. Any questions that we kind of hit a slow spot? Anything from the lecture or the material that you're struggling with or have questions on?
I was just gonna ask what we should read or what we should really go over in the book, because there's so many different. Sorry, my food just got done, but there's so many different topics, obviously.
Yeah.
So just how do we differentiate what we're supposed to be? I mean, obviously we should read the whole all of it, but taking notes wise.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good question, and sort of one of these things that sort of is, I think, people struggle with in terms of transition into sort of university level work, right? And again, one of the reasons that you should do as I say, not as I do, to the extent that you can avoid trying to sort of read through and take notes on everything right now, right? Sort of the day before a lecture. It'll help with that, right? You sort of spread things out. If you can schedule time and say, okay, at this time is when I sit down and do psych work, which makes me want to punch myself in the head, but this is what I do. It'll help sort of spread this out a little bit so it doesn't feel so overwhelming. So you're trying to go through all that stuff. And if you go through, take notes as you're going through and working through that module. Now, in the modules, if it has stuff in text boxes and sort of the more you should know stuff, don't worry about that, right? And you don't have to worry about names. I'm not going to say, Professor so-and-so did a study in 1967. What did they find in that? I mean, I'm not going to ask you sort of pop quiz trivia stuff like that, right? But you should be focusing on bolded terms, italicized terms, right? Making sure that you have sort of those, and not just memorizing definitions or writing down definitions, also included sort of what are the examples? So what does this look like? What is if I were to see this on the street, what would a scenario be, right? And so taking down examples from the book, but coming up with your own, right? If you've got a good example, write it down, because you're going to remember that better if it's something from your own life as opposed to something Myers is telling you. And if you're not sure if it's a good example, email me and be like, hey, I'm reading about this, so I'm thinking, would this be an example of that? I'll be like, yeah, cool, it is, or tweak it a little bit, or you kind of got that confused with something else. So I'll help you get on the right track with that. But the application is going to be important, right? Because I can memorize a whole bunch of stuff and not know much of anything. If you can go through and apply it, and sort of with some of these questions where I'm like, Jacob did X and then Sierra did Y, sort of this would be an example of sort of what, right? That's the stuff that I'm really wanting you to get at it, sort of pulling some of this stuff together.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Other questions? Nothing. Okay, cool. Well, in my head, I just
I guess I do have one.
Okay, good.
When it comes to childhood trauma and stuff, in the book it said that people build up a resilience.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean that can't be true in all cases. Yeah. Obviously some kids are still gonna adults are gonna be messed up still from their childhood trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's so. I think the thing is to remember, and I think the point that Myers is trying to make in this is that people are incredibly resilient. Okay. And no one wants it's uncomfortable if you study this stuff sort of like I do. So you recognize how often all this terrible stuff happens. It's normative, right? It's not rare. It's not weird. it's happening constantly all the time in the background, right? But when we look and see how people are functioning as adults, or sort of as they move on, obviously not everybody is terribly impaired or crippled or broken or things along these lines, right? And this is sort of where that resilience factor comes in, right? In terms of PTSD, there's models of PTSD that think about some of these chronic symptoms not so much as something that develops, but as some sort of failure in your natural resilience, right? So immediately after something terrible, almost everybody's going to have some level of distress. If you're not, that's weird, right? If you're in a terrible accident, if you've been assaulted, if you've been abused or something along those lines, if you're a human being, it's normal for you to have sort of intense reaction to that, right? But what we see is over time, people sort of get back down to a baseline where they're sort of more or less back to where they were before, right? When we see chronic pathology, what we can think about that is for some reason people get stuck, right, in that natural trajectory where the majority of folks will continue to sort of go back down to get back to sort of where they were. I got stuck and I'm struggling and I'm not back to where I was before, whereas other people might have achieved that, right? And so what we say is that sort of resilience reaction got interrupted a little bit, right? And so depending on sort of the event, sort of there's more or less likely to get sort of interrupted there. But I think sort of Meyer's point is saying that people are incredibly resilient, and it's important to recognize people's resilience, that unfortunately this stuff is going on in the background all the time. But for the most part, it's not saying that it's not difficult and it's not sad and it's not hard, but then people generally are able to get sort of back to where they were. Sometimes they don't. And this is where sort of we go through and we have treatments and sort of working through stuff. And so that's kind of the big question, is why some people achieve that resilience and some people don't. It's a $1 million question in trauma-focused research. But sort of that's kind of sort of how we would think about that stuff. But again, thinking about sort of some of the stuff we've talked about here, this interaction of genetics and environment, right? Maybe some people are just more have sort of a general genetic predisposition towards negative emotion and anxiety and sort of be worried about stuff. And so then maybe it might be, if that's me, if I'm just an anxious person, I have something terrible happen to me, friend has something terrible happen to me, I have a hard time bouncing back just because I'm sort of characteristically just a more anxious, sort of prone to negative emotion and rumination and things like that than my friend, right? Or sort of I have something bad happen to me, my identical twin has something bad happen to me, but then there's something else that sort of happens that sort of goes through and sort of makes me more vulnerable. Could be an environmental stressor, right? Maybe my twin is living somewhere else and they're having good social support and I don't. People thinking that I'm weird and so you're going to be messed up, but people don't think that about my twin. So these are the types of things that we believe to start to impact some of that trauma reaction. Does that help? Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else?
Dr. J, this might be a complete digression and
That's fine. I'm into digressions today.
pure personal curiosity. How might all those things like resiliency, motor development, social development, cognitive development, how might all that be influenced or hindered by someone with failure to thrive?
Yeah. So for those who aren't familiar, failure to thrive, a term used to describe usually kids who are not developing or reaching milestones that we would expect from children of a certain developmental stage. And a lot of times this ends up being associated with neglect, abuse, things along these lines. And so when we had talked about some unfortunate natural experiments in the world, right? Sort of those orphanage cases, right? When someone comes in and so you see kids in an orphanage and there's no one around so the kids aren't technically being abused or put at risk. They're getting food. They've got more or less shelter. And so technically basic needs are being met. But you've got kids who have delays in language and cognition and sort of motor stuff, right? And so what it just speaks to is, in terms of good adaptive development, how important it is to have interactions with other people, and how important it is to have appropriate sort of engaging environment. It's not any different than animals, right? Like you see, if sort of people do animal research, if I put an animal in a an enclosure that has opportunities for play and some sort of engagement, those animals do a hell of a lot better than, if you see old school zoo stuff, right? They're like, oh, I've got a box with a bar cage. I'm going to put an animal in there where it doesn't have anything to do, nothing to engage with. Sort of things start to drop off real fast, right? But what's interesting, Jonathan, with this and sort of the failure to thrive is we start to see impacts in terms of physiology, psychology, development stuff that seems like it maybe shouldn't necessarily be related to how often I interact with other people or opportunities for play or sort of engagement or creativity. But we do see it. We know that's a very real thing, right? And so some of it's probably behavioral, right? But other things sort of go through in play. And sort of just speaks to, again, in that one slide where we're talking about humans being social creatures, right? We need to be around people. And so this whole COVID thing, like there's a legitimate concern that if I just sit around in my apartment, don't interact with anybody, that's not great for me, for my mental health, or a lot of different things, right? And so, there's pandemic, right? There's things we need to do to make sure that we're not making other people sick. But sort of, again, recognizing that sort of we just don't do well just all by ourselves from a psychological standpoint. And so sort of recognizing that impact, particularly with young kids. Does that kind of help or get at some of the stuff that you were thinking about there, Jonathan?
A little.
Okay. Shoot me an email if you got sort of additional questions and things like that. I might, if I can't figure it out, I'll get you hooked in with someone who can.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. All right. Anything else? Okay, cool. Well, you guys are rock stars. You're going to knock this out of the park. Good luck with prep. If you have any questions, send me an email. I'll get you squared away. If you have questions about anything that you did want to bring up or forgot to bring up, we'll go through and post this if you want to go back through and be like, oh, Clap was talking about interesting things, but I was getting my burrito and I missed it. We'll go through and get that done. Quiz will be same time, same place, just like everything else. So if I don't hear from you before then, we will see you all on Friday. Okay? Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah,
folks.
thank you.
Yep. Have a good evening.